Good afternoon, everyone. I suspect we'll have stragglers coming back from lunch, but if we can all take our seats and focus forward so we can get back on track. This has been a fantastic day, and I'll give some brief closing remarks at the end, but want to dive into what I suspect many in the room are excited to hear, and that is what the funder community has in store for mission-driven work, but also efficiency and how that relates to mission-driven work. And I'm sure you'll have lots of questions that pertain to your day-to-day lives. But my role, quite simply, is to introduce our moderator, Jennifer Baumgartner from the Energy Foundation. And I'll give the resume in a second. But for those of you who have not gotten to spend time with Jennifer, she is knowledgeable, is an understatement, passionate, committed, and has been a fantastic partner to SIA and to people in the space, continues to not only look for ways to support us, but more importantly, build capacity within the region. And so it's really exciting when you have people that are as committed to or more the work than you are actually some days when you get up to the office and get ready to sometimes beat your head against the wall for the next issue. So thank you for your partnership. Thank you for being here. On the technical side, she is officially the program director of the Energy Foundation's Southeast Regional Program. She covers 12 states, and the goal is really to build durable support for clean energy and identify new and innovative approaches that can gain traction in the Southeast. And that portfolio also includes renewables, energy efficiency, buildings and building codes, where they've particularly been a partner of ours, and then constituency development and engagement, much like we're doing here. Before coming to the Energy Foundation, Jennifer was the Assistant Secretary for Energy with the North Carolina Department of Commerce and served 2 governors as a policy advisor. Couldn't think of a better person to lead this panel, and thanks for your partnership. So turn it over to you.
Thank you. What Michael was kind enough not to say is that of all of my colleagues on this distinguished panel, I am the newest to philanthropy and the least experienced, so they were smart to make me the moderator. Therefore, I can be quiet and learn from everybody else. But it's really a pleasure to be able to be with you all today and to wrap up the day thinking a little bit about what are the opportunities and the challenges from a funder perspective. We have a really wide variety of different perspectives and ways of engaging in the funding landscape represented on the panel today. And so I hope for all of you that will be a helpful and productive conversation, and one that you'll feel free to engage us in vigorously as you have in all of the other panels. The way we're going to start today is just to briefly introduce my co-panelists and let everybody say a bit about him or herself. And then we'll go a bit deeper into some of the work that we've done, and hopefully, again, have a chance to focus both on the synergies at the local and the state and potentially even at the national level, but also talk through what I think are really some of the challenges and the gaps that are out there in the landscape from a funder perspective. And we are the after lunch panel following a very robust lineup of earlier guests, so be kind to us and try to laugh at our jokes if we make them. We need that. So joining me today on the panel, we have Jenny Russell, the Executive Director of the Merck Family Fund. We have Danielle Sass-Burnett with DOE, Director of the Better Buildings Program. We have Barry Berlin, the Managing Director of Atlantic Trust, and particularly an advisor to the Candida Fund. And we also have with us Aaron Drury, who is a philanthropic advisor with the Community Foundation for Greater Atlanta. So I'm going to ask each of them to just say a little bit more about their particular organization and role. And Jenny, if it's all right, maybe we'll start at that end.
Sure.
Thank you.
I'm also the farthest away. I was thinking when John Knott started this morning, he said he was from here, so everyone was keeping him honest. Well, I'm from away, so I think I can say anything I want, right? No one will know the difference, so beware. Don't take anything I say with it seriously. But I come here very enthusiastically from the Boston area. I am the Executive Director of the Merck Family Fund. This is a private family foundation that has been in existence since 1954. It was started with 11,000 shares of Merck & Co. stock, donated by George W. Merck, and has since grown quite substantially, and is now run entirely, at least the trustees are all family. So we're now in 3rd and 4th generation of family members that is trustee. I'm the hired gun as executive director. And the average age of the trustees is now 32. So it's quite interesting in terms of the dynamics that they bring to the table. I'm learning how to text now very, very well. We have had, I would say, as an undercurrent or sort of the backbone of interest is around climate change. And the way we have specifically defined that for the purposes of today's conversation is around energy efficiency. So I'm happy to talk more about that once we go into round two.
Thanks. Danielle?
Sure. Good afternoon. Danielle Sass-Burnett, and I oversee the Better Buildings Neighborhood Program, as introduced. I came to DOE specifically for that job and was brought over from EPA, so I have a background with climate and clean energy, and that's really the interest. But the Better Buildings Neighborhood Program, for those of you who don't know, which is probably not too many of you in this audience, is a $508 million Recovery Act funded grant program. Really, it's intended to be an innovative program, an innovation grant. We at DOE, and specifically within the Buildings Office who oversees it, have seen it as seed funding and saw it as venture capital type funding is how we like to think about it. We're probably not a typical federal office or group. We have tried to be rather innovative and adaptable and entrepreneurial and tried to work with you to make sure you felt the ability to do that as well. But because this was a Recovery Act funded program, we saw that it was a one-time shot and that we needed to get as much as we could out of it collectively, learn the lessons, understand what works and what didn't work, and try to create an environment where we can help broadcast your successes, broadcast what the future might look like as far as effective residential and commercial, to a lesser extent, energy efficiency programs, so that we could enable you to go out and find other funding opportunities, because we couldn't have predicted sequestration and continuing resolutions, but we at the same time didn't really think that we were likely to have too many other opportunities to fund something on this scale. So we'll have to see what the future really does end up looking like from a funding perspective, but it has been very exciting to see what's going on, and I look forward to the discussion about how we can help further, perhaps without just funding the way we've had in the past.
Perry?
The Candida Fund has been active both locally and nationally for about 20 years. And really has accelerated its grant making the last 10 years or so with a spend down plan that should last another 4 or 5 years. Now, several years ago, I would have told you another 4 or 5 years, so we'll see how it goes. But environment and sustainability have been a central focus of Candida Fund for a long time, and it will continue to be. It's easier to see the pattern if you look in retrospect, because I'm not too sure there was as clear a plan as it would appear to be today. But looking back, the funding tends to fall into 3 groupings. One would be shifting hearts and minds to create more mainstream concern over the environment, and did that through some pulpit-based activities, funding new media, funding a variety of groups that sought to center the environmental argument in a more mainstream audience. Second, some big projects that were sort of signature projects or events geared towards getting people outdoors, getting people concerned again about the quality of the outdoor experience, and that might be a substantial expansion at the Atlanta Botanical Garden, or fostering some improvements in our national parks through National Park Conservation Association and things like that, with the idea that when people are outdoors and experience the outdoors, they get a better feel for some of the challenges around the environment. And then finally, more specifically, in a good bit of this locally, focusing on energy efficiency and building quality, and the whole LEED program, healthy buildings, and the like, and it really have been very active here in Atlanta with creating a Grants to Green program through our partners at the Community Foundation, working with the Better Buildings Challenge downtown, working with South Face, and a variety of partners to to make some real and lasting improvement in the built environment that has, energy and utilities implications for a long, long time. And in essence, with those nonprofits, we've helped in that activity a way to endow those institutions through cost savings, through their cost savings. So I could go on, but that's the gist of some of the focus areas for Candida over the last few years and most likely in the future.
I'm Erin Drury. I'm a philanthropic advisor at the Community Foundation for Greater Atlanta. We're one of 12 community foundations in the state of Georgia. We cover 23 counties in metro Atlanta. I work on the side of the shop that works with our donor-advised funds, and we have about 750 different donor-advised funds, which are all funds initiated by individual donors. And my job is to work very closely those donors on their giving and help them with their philanthropy. And so that means something different to every one of those donors, but we try to be a matchmaker, essentially, and find the right nonprofits that match their interest areas. And that can mean a lot of different things. It may be that we meet with their family and talk about interest areas and values that the family shares. We may take their family on site visits to different organizations that we recommend, that we think are good organizations. We write reports and assessments on nonprofits to share with the individuals so they can feel confident in their giving. We provide funding recommendations on different nonprofits to those individuals. So really a variety of things, but we mostly try to be a resource to our donors so that they feel they have a source to come to for what are the trends in philanthropy, what are the best practices of nonprofits, who are the best organizations, what are things that need to be done in our community to make it better. So that's my work.
And I'll just briefly say a little bit about the Energy Foundation, since part of my role is both to be a panelist and to be the moderator today. Energy Foundation, for a little more than 20 years, has been working in the space to promote a movement toward a clean energy future. And so our focus is largely sector-driven. We have programs in transportation, climate, renewables, efficiency, buildings, and coal. We also more recently have begun to think about how we can overlay that deep kind of sector-based technical expertise with models that help us understand how to work with particularly constituencies that we think are important, and how to work in key geographies. And to the key geographies point, that actually explains a lot about why I'm here with you today, because while Energy Foundation is San Francisco based, we've certainly worked all over the country, but we realized that there was really a level of opportunity and a level of need in the Southeast that we thought justified having an expanded programmatic focus here. And so about a year and a half ago, we opened an office in Raleigh, North Carolina, and that's where I work from. And again, we work through our Southeast work on most of these areas, transportation being one exception. And we also work to think about how to really build across the board deeper and broader support, what we call durable support for clean energy. So we look to engage constituencies ranging from business and economic development to the faith community to the military in certain states, and really trying to think about creative ways that we can find approaches that will gain traction in this region that has at times been slower than we might have wanted it to be in picking up on some of these developments. So I think it might be helpful, since we're focused today primarily on energy efficiency, for some of us at least to talk a little bit more about the specific investments that our respective foundations and organizations are making in energy efficiency. And I wonder if there's anybody who'd like to kick that off.
Maybe I could describe the Grants to Green program a little bit, and Erin chime in if you'd like, because we do this in conjunction with the Community Foundation in Southface. A few years ago, after sufficiently moving hearts and minds to the mainstream and wanting to maybe do some more tangible improvements in energy use and conservation, we approached the Community Foundation in Southface about a partnership where Candida Candida would fund an ongoing activity to provide environmental assessments and retrofit dollars for actual projects, up to $50,000, for any place-based nonprofit in the 23 or 24 county area served by the Atlanta Community Foundation. And there are hundreds of nonprofits that qualify, and we qualified it a little further, and they had to be a certain scale, and they had to either own or have a long lease for their buildings, and they had to have a board and paid staff, and a few other things to narrow the field a little bit, to somewhat more institutional grantee pool, and organized an advisory committee and organized the assessment resources through Southface, and developed a methodology and targeted an employee or two at the Community Foundation to help see this through. Where now, 5, 6 years later, we can look back, and we have a consultant sort of follow the work, can look back and see that for the impacted institutions, 20 to 25% utility savings are fairly common in water and in energy use. And none of this was sexy work. I mean, this is turning the lights down. It's sealing the envelopes of buildings. It's replacing windows. It's changing out the lighting grids, tweaks to HVAC, wrapping ductwork. It's not very exciting, but very often nonprofits have the buildings they've either been given or the ones they could barely afford to buy. I mean, they're not always the greatest facilities. And, working with our group, we're impacting 25 or so of these facilities every year. And I don't know that there's really a measurement of this, but I mean, I would think we have one of the greenest nonprofit sectors, at least in terms of facilities in the United States. Candida would like to replicate that program, or would see it replicated in your communities, those of you not from here, and we'll work with you on that. We'll work with you on funding that. But the on-the-ground resources here, I don't think they were unique to Atlanta, but we had right place and time kind of considerations here, where we had a willing partner in the Community Foundation. We had Southface with the abundant resources, intellectual resources they bring to bear, and a willingness to work with us, and we're able to make this happen here. The Better Buildings Challenge, in its own way, is a replication of this program, the far different scale. I mean, there's 50 million square feet signed up in the Better Buildings Challenge in Atlanta, and that's just commercial space downtown, midtown, and some of the neighboring areas. And many of those are commercial buildings and not appropriate for philanthropic dollars to address. But Candida has helped with that as well as a next generation project following Grants to Green, and helped by funding Southface's involvement in that, and funding Central Atlanta Progress to some degree to help with the staff complement that they provided to that activity. So saving the world through improving buildings is sort of a known activity. I'm no expert. I'm not an engineer. I couldn't crawl through the crawl space and tell you what to do, although I've seen a few of them now. And a good way to ruin your suit. But I see the consultant reports and the like following our activity, and I see how excited the institutions are to have an opportunity to improve their facilities, and I see how contagious it is through those institutions, their boards, and their employees carrying out similar projects on their own, in their own places of business or in their homes. So we wanted to have a ripple effect from this activity, and I really think we have. So it's a long digression, but that's one program I think we're very proud of.
Erin, is there anything you want to add to that from the Community Foundation perspective?
Well, it's been a really neat partnership. I think what it's done is there's a lot of nonprofits who are stretched staff-wise. They're focused very narrowly on their mission, and this has kind of opened up a different thing that they didn't know very much about sometimes. One of the aspects of the grant is you have to have a champion on staff or on the board who kind of shepherds the process and becomes an expert about the building. And I think, it's been interesting to see some of the people who've gotten involved who before they got this grant, they had no interest in environmental efficiency at all, and so it's kind of spreading the gospel of environmental efficiency in an unexpected way. It's also, from my work too, it's been a way to, for donors who are interested in the environment, it's been a way to kind of piggyback off of the work that Grants to Green has done and further things that the nonprofit wanted to do. So if one of the things they wanted to do was replace their HVAC or add new toilets, then I can recommend that to one of my donors as something they could do on top of some of the work they've already started. But I think the South Face assessment it's been a great thing for a lot of nonprofits in Atlanta. So.
Thank you. Jenny?
Well, I can give you a very different approach that we've taken. It's admirable because what Barry and Aaron have done is provide tangibles where really the community can see the difference, and that's why it's very engaging. We at the Merck Family Fund have taken a slightly different approach, which is to think about policy and what avenues can affect policy one way or another. And the one sort of slice that we have focused in on is the IRPs. And a couple of years ago, I was like, IRPs, what the heck is that? I have no idea what you're talking about. And what we have come to realize is that is a potential place where a tipping point can be made. And so what we are trying to do is to draw back the curtain a little bit on this process and to support organizations that are providing expert testimony and witness and doing two things, one or three things really, is to push with some aggression on goals for the IRP process, to watchdog them through the process, and to sort of translate out of the room for the rest of the public what's going on and what is the result and how does that happen and what can we monitor along the way. It's sort of keeping the folks honest and moving forward. So it's a slightly different approach. It's very targeted, and we're grateful that there are those folks who can do it.
Sure, go ahead, Danielle.
I just would be remiss sitting up here if I didn't ask all of the Better Buildings Southeast Consortium members to raise their hands who are in the audience, because I know there's a bunch of you. And, okay, so you're not a majority, but you all are doing a fantastic job. And I wanted to, since many of you know what's happening with the Better Buildings Neighborhood Program funds, I wanted to let you know that I just, on the plane last night, got to look at our data from Q4 2012, and the cumulative number of residential upgrades at this point since the grants in 2010 has crossed the 50,000 mark. So there are 50,000 homeowners across the country who are benefiting every day from the work that you all are doing on the ground. And I know that the number is frankly quite a bit higher because we get the numbers quite a bit later. But there's a lot of really important work happening on the ground that folks have heard about. And so I just wanted to call out.
Right. And I would just add, in much the same vein from an Energy Foundation perspective that Jenny discussed in terms of Merck, we are a very policy-focused foundation. And so much of our work in the energy efficiency space is focused on regulatory processes like IRPs or rate cases or other issues depending on the state and the utility. I think we also have had some engagement in legislative issues where those are appropriate in different venues in state government. But finally, I think one of the things that we are increasingly starting to think about, and it's very resonant with this idea of looking at how we work with a more diverse group of constituencies and how we focus, Barry, I think to your hearts and minds point on really trying to think about ways to build support for these issues that we care about. We have been looking at how to engage a broader variety of actors and voices in a lot of this very traditional utility-centric planning and regulatory kinds of work. And so that's one of the places where I think we've really had an interest in thinking about, community voices, business voices, economic development voices, innovative programs that are working in other places, and ultimately, how can we take this region, which has, in which many of the states have certain qualities in common, both in terms of culture and in terms of certain things about their utility landscape, and really leverage learning from one place to another and potentially use that as a leverage point to drive change. So we're very interested in thinking about things both from a state-centric perspective and how that flows up to a national policy goal, but also in thinking about how we look at the Southeast as a region and really think about using what we have here and things that are working and not working to try to drive forward to what we think is a much better scenario from a clean energy perspective.
Can I add something just about
Sure.
voices? There are two different voices that I want to bring up. One is when Mike Smith talked this morning about South Carolina Help My House, what he didn't mention was that they have a Washington counterpart that we have actually supported that give them a shout out at the federal level. And the local story is critically important, and he was able to tell it very well. But the need to rise that up is even greater when we're talking about federal policy and how the pilot might be able to be replicated. The second voice I just wanted to raise is the importance of networks. And there are hundreds of networks in the Southeast that are working on climate change in a variety of different ways. And I know that Kellen Garrison is here. Kellen, can you raise your hand? Yeah. So she runs the U.S. Climate Action Network Southeast glue, I would say, more than anything, of all of the groups that are working on it. And both of those types of organizations, the networking organization or raising it up at the federal level, adds the voice to these issues.
Thank you, Jenny. Barry, I wonder if you and Aaron might talk a little bit about the idea of, this idea of expanding grants to green, and particularly maybe talk a little bit about what you all have looked at in terms of finding partners at the local level and what kind of things you've learned are really important in making those partnerships successful.
Aaron's looking at me. Thanks a lot. I thought you were my friend. Our initial thought was that other community foundations around the country would get religion on this and want to roll out similar programs because they have to identify a local donor and that sort of thing. And we spoke, a few years ago at a conclave of community foundations from around the country. And what can I tell you? It's, we're still the first and only. So it's a little disappointing. And things require sponsorship and probably a funder willing to extend themselves and get out there and do this work. But there are some other ways to scale this work, and we're really just exploring those now. And I'm not too sure how these funding models will come about, but there are many charities that have a national footprint. They might have local associations or almost a franchise network. Planned Parenthood comes to mind, Big Brothers and Big Sisters, Boys and Girls Clubs. There are a variety of national charities that fit this sort of distributed model of service who taken together thousands of facilities around the country. We haven't partnered yet with a particular charity like that would roll out a program like Grants to Green, but from their headquarters operation as a service to their constituents. And that would be an interesting way to do more of this at scale, I think. And that might be a pool that rather than a straight out grant pool, which is what we've done here, that none of it's refundable, none of it is in the form of loans. But with pick any of those organizations, Planned Parenthood, let's pick on them for a minute, maybe put $5 million in play and have them use that as a revolving pool where the energy savings at the local level replenish the pool so that other of their franchises, if you will, can take advantage of it. So we're still sort of playing with that, and I don't have a good example, but I think there's some other ways to expand the model. And of course, Better Buildings Challenge in its own way is a clone of this program. It's a clone on steroids, but still, it's the same kind of thing of Grants to Green, if nothing else, proved out that a little bit of money and a little bit of sweat and intelligent design through the assessment, South Face or other engineers, it saves money. I mean, it saves the organization money. What landlord wouldn't want to do that? But they have to have the money to fund the project, and if it's a commercial landlord and they already have 4 mortgages, it's not so easy. So yeah, again, I'm not too sure there's a model in the nonprofit sector to help in that commercial situation. But there are also examples, a school with multiple buildings. Would love to see Georgia State, sort of get organized around this issue with 30-plus buildings, I think, downtown, and not a lick of green. So there are large clusters like that can be tackled at scale, but we're still sort of exploring.
I'm curious whether you all have a sense of kind of what the average cost for the retrofits or the measures have been for the projects. I mean, the 25% savings number is
20 to 25.
significant.
Yeah, I mean, most of the projects have been around $100,000, and it's a matching thing. So that, we want the organization to have their skin in the game. So 50 from the pool that we've created, and another 50 from the board or whatever of the charity. And with that kind of spend, they're driving. Relate that to dollars and payback. I'm not too sure I can do that, but I think South Face told me recently that there's been something on the order of $750,000 in utilities savings versus by now $3 or $4 million spent on improvements. Maybe that's a ratio to think about. I don't think the payback timeline is as short as we'd like to see it. But for the underlying organization, if half of it's funded by a nonprofit, then it collapses the payback period in half, right? Because you only had to pay for half. So it's probably made the economics of these projects far more palpable to the organizations.
Danielle, I'm wondering if you might want to talk a little bit. I know because many of the people in this room have been engaged in the Better Buildings Neighborhood Program. Do you want to talk a little bit about, from a DOE perspective, what you see as opportunities going forward for the people who've been engaged in those programs, and perhaps some of where you think are opportunities to look in terms of funding and sustainability financially?
Sure, I'm happy to. I think I don't have any great exciting announcements to offer, unfortunately. As far as I know, we're not doing another Recovery Act, sadly. And we need to get through the next couple months. Obviously, you're all aware of the national news, so I don't know what the funding outlook really looks like in dollars and cents. But the one area where we do expect to continue offering grants and providing funding is with the State Energy Program out of the Office of Weatherization and Intergovernmental Programs, OWIP. And out of OWIP, the DOE does fund state energy offices across the country. There is, I think, a lot of enthusiasm for what can happen at the state and local level for very good reason. And certainly the models that you all are proving show that there's a tremendous return on investment that's possible through that kind of funding. And so I can't offer a lot right now from the federal level directly, but certainly continuing the relationships with the state energy offices and making sure for those local programs that your presence is known, your capabilities are known, your results are known to the state energy offices is one way of tapping into the federal funds. There's also a lot of attention being given to the idea of how can we help equip you at least with information, which is hopefully valuable. It needs to be. It is valuable. And actually, there was recently a really great webinar series that our sister agency put on at EPA. The State and Local Climate and Energy Program put on a series in around May of 2012 about finding funding and how to think about strategically bringing down your costs so that the funding you need is less, figuring out how to find in-kind support so that the funding you need is less, and then what the different options are out on the table. And they used a consultant to help put this really great webinar series together. So I've got a couple copies. You can meet me afterwards and get the details, but you can find that online as well, which should provide some ideas. It doesn't make the checks come in automatically, of course, but We intend to continue to promote those kinds of things and also really try to help you bring the costs down. And so being able to memorialize and amplify what really works should help bring down the costs of delivering these kinds of programs. So at least we can make the equations balance a little closer if you can tap into these and other networks to actually find the dollar sign side.
One of the things that Candida's worked on, and I'm not too sure where we are with this, is working with Sustainable Atlanta, another organization we helped fund and found a number of years ago locally, to develop through a web device, if a homeowner in a certain zip code or whatever wants to do an energy overhaul of their home, what resources are available to them. And there may be a site where you can do that today, but very often the answer to these kinds of questions, well, it depends. It depends on if you're in this or if you're in that, if your home is valued here, or if you're above water or underwater, or which power provider you use, or whatever. I mean, so it depends. So an interactive device, if you will, which is under construction today, I think, for that web device, to allow a property owner and or a homeowner to see what's available. And it might be specific tax credits, or it might be something from Georgia Power. I mean, who knows? But at least to have a better understanding of what's out there, so that those who are motivated don't have to find the needle in the haystack to get their project done.
Jenny, I wondered if you might want to say a little bit more about the way Merck thinks about the work that you do with the IRP process, and maybe if there's a particularly good example that you might be able to share that kind of highlights what the opportunities are by focusing in that policy space.
Yeah, I guess I think of the first one that comes to mind is the Duke Progress merger.
Yeah.
And how many folks sort of showed up to say, but, have you thought about this? You should do that. Don't lose Save-A-Watt. Take it further. And I thought that was tremendously helpful on both sides, because it pushed both parties and helped them, I think, agree to a level of commitment that will keep them honest going forward. So that was rewarding to see. Obviously it's an ongoing process, and we'll see how it plays out. But it was very important to have people in the room that knew what both parties were capable of and were able to track what had been done already with the Save-A-Watt program. So that's one that comes to mind right away.
It's a great example. One of the things that I think we wanted to spend some time talking about today is to talk through a little bit what we see as some of the trends, in philanthropy in this area, and also maybe what are some of the emerging opportunities. And I'll say one of the things that's been challenging for me personally, coming into Energy Foundation about a year and a half ago, is that overall, I think for many of us, funding opportunities are constrained from where they have been in previous years, potentially. Philanthropy has certainly felt, the effect of a down economy in the same way that many groups on the ground and families have. And so I think there's that feeling of not having always enough resources to go out and do, all of the work that we'd like to be doing. On the other hand, I think it's prompted, at least in the conversations I've been a part of, some real thoughtfulness about what are other models and how can we, as philanthropies and as foundations, help further those other models, and really what can our roles be. And so I thought we might explore a little bit of that today. And particularly, Erin, if you might start and talk more about the role of single donor advised funds and explain a little bit more about how that works.
Okay. So for the Community Foundation for Greater Atlanta, we have 750 donor advised funds. We have a little bit of money in our unrestricted fund that we grant out like a typical foundation would to nonprofits of our choice. But for us, most of the money is in donor advised funds, and we are kind of at the will of our donors for most of our grant making. And we certainly try to help them with their grant making and influence them where we can if they want some influence. But would just say every community foundation is different across the country, and there's some states have lots of community foundations. I think Indiana has one in every county. We have 12, and they're all different. Sometimes they're funded primarily by one funder. Sometimes it's very heavily corporate funded. And so they're all going to act a little differently how they work. For us, we're primarily donor-advised funds. And so we have a heavy donor focus, which, just a little background on what a donor-advised fund is. Maybe you already know, I don't know. But we have, what happens with a donor-advised fund, it's almost like a mini foundation or a private charitable checking account, essentially. You have a fund in your name, and then you can give that money out over your lifetime to the nonprofits of your choice. You get the tax deduction in the year that you give it. So a lot of people set up a donor-advised fund in place of a private foundation, and they range from $50,000. Well, I would say you can start a fund with $5,000. So we have some from $5,000 to over $20 million. And everything in between. And so, as you can imagine, with 750 different donor-advised funds, the interests are very varied. And so, one thing I think about is that I don't have many donors who say, "Oh, I'm really interested in energy efficiency," but what they say is, "I'm really interested in the environment, and I'm really interested in nonprofits saving money," or they don't use energy efficiency in the language of their interest. And so, but if they say environment, to me, there's lots of ways you can go in that direction. And so, what we would do is present different ideas to them about, oh, are you interested in walking paths? Are you interested in more park space? Are you interested in water issues, clean air, the list goes on, but you really just, we try to figure out what the donor's particularly interested in. And sometimes it's broad, and I have donors who are really interested in park space. They've always been really interested in park space, and they don't, but we still can come to them and say, are you interested in, replacing these toilets in this nonprofit building, a nonprofit you're usually not interested in funding. And they're like, oh yeah, I want to replace every toilet in the city of Atlanta. So, and sometimes the donors don't know.
What do you do with the old toilets?
Yeah. and sometimes the donors don't know. I think that's one thing that, they don't know they don't say they're interested in energy efficiency, but that doesn't mean that they're not. It's just not maybe been on their radar as things that they knew they could even fund. So one thing is just look at your local community foundation and see how they work. If they have a philanthropic services team or a donor services team, those are the people who work with the donors at that community foundation. And we are very eager to meet with nonprofits in our community and learn about what they're doing so that we can recommend them to donors if there's a fit. Because our biggest interest is making this perfect match of a donor who's really interested in something and a nonprofit that's doing that work. And it really could be anything. But the biggest thing is just look at your local community foundation and see what they fund and how they fund and talk to them. Usually they're very open to meeting with people and learning about different needs and causes in their community.
So I think your observation that many of the donors who are active in these funds don't necessarily come in saying, wow, I want to do energy efficiency. It seems like there's a lot of bearing in that statement for how people in this room might think about presenting their work. And I wonder if you have any advice in terms of as people might go and look for opportunities to present their programs to their community foundation or really engage with them. Are there ways to describe this work to better help connect it to some of those values that donors may come in the door with if energy efficiency's, maybe not first on the list, hopefully third, fourth, or fifth?
Yeah. Well, we as the community foundation, and probably most community foundations, we love to hear about partners. We love to hear that you're working with so many other different groups, and how do you work, that you're not doing your work individually, because we're sensitive to the fact there's over 10,000 nonprofits in the city, in the metro Atlanta area, and so we don't like to hear somebody else has started another nonprofit because there's such a competition for funds. And so whenever you can say we're partnering with this group, or we're really in tune with all the different aspects of this work, and we know all the partners, we like to hear that. And then it can leverage your individual work as well to say, maybe your piece is just this little thing, but it plays into a much larger community work. Had another thought. The other thing is, think about it broadly. I mean, it's not just about the environment. It's about the health of people. It's about families. It's about veterans getting into homes. I mean, it's usually a much broader than your individual piece of it. And I think whenever you can think broadly and tie it into a broader section of people, you might find ways into funding streams that you didn't normally think of.
That's great advice. Yeah, Jenny.
Yeah, about funding trends. There's about 80,000 private foundations in the country, and that's growing. It's an industry, actually, that has a great trajectory as well with donor-advised funds. I'm sure you've got a great growth curve there. And likewise, within the industry, believe it or not, there is an industry of philanthropy. There are a number of affinity groups and reasons why we meet together to have different interests. And I bring this up only to say that there's one group called the Climate and Energy Funders Group, which when it first started about 5 years ago had 10 funders, and now they have over 500 funders that come to meetings. So this is a very important I would say, intersection of interests. And as it relates to energy efficiency, obviously, it's a great greenhouse gas reduction for just your entry point, but then that's just a starting point. Then you've got the savings and the job creation and better living conditions, et cetera, et cetera. So I believe that there is opportunity and there is interest, and as climate change becomes more and more obvious and accepted, there will be more interest in solutions, and energy efficiency is certainly one of them.
Danielle, I'm wondering if there's anything that you've seen from a DOE perspective that you would lift up for the group that maybe is sort of a great example, or even a best practice of groups who are really going out and trying to think creatively about how to continue to fund work in these areas and how to diversify that funding base.
Sure. The most compelling proposals, and I assume that this is not just coming from a federal perspective, but are those that really look more like business plans and that have a very clear, have clearly laid out what the strategies are, what the barriers are, what are the problems that are trying to be solved through the efforts of the group, the organization, its partners. What are the solutions, and why do you think that those solutions will work? On what basis? The more data, the better, certainly. Qualitative counts, doesn't have to be just quantitative at least. And what's the projection look like? With X, we will achieve Y. Without X, we're not going to achieve Y. We're going to achieve Y minus 5, and that extra 5 is critically important to get to a place of scale or replicability or solving XYZ problem, so that we can see if it will work elsewhere, et cetera. So the more thoroughly that can be laid out, the more clear it is as far as why this and not something else, the better position that you will be in. And certainly I've had plenty of potential grant proposals come by my desk and then go on to others, such as you all, and that's the key advice that I've tried to provide, and have seen some of them be quite successful, which is really exciting, certainly.
I wonder if anybody else on the panel has anything to contribute sort of on this point of best practices or things that you see in terms of grant applications that cross your desk that really point you to who is going to be a standout grantee or a standout proposal. I mean, I will say, I think for us, one of the standard questions that we ask does have to do, Danielle, with your point, to challenges. And it's always really interesting to me to see that the people who, obviously you're writing for a funder and you frame things in a way that makes your challenges seem like opportunities, which they should be. But on the other hand, I think I've noticed that when you have a group that really seems to have grappled with what are the challenges and what are the particular barriers, and seems to understand how to articulate those barriers and those challenges in a clear way, those tend to be the proposals that ultimately I think are the stronger proposals, because the entire proposal can then sort of be informed by what are the things that we can go through the process thinking about to address these. And, you know, in a lot of cases, what it points to, I think, you know, Jenny, to your point about networks and partnerships, as other people have spoken about, you know, sometimes identifying those barriers and challenges really helps crystallize where there are other organizations that can be supportive in overcoming those, and where there are partnerships that can actually add value in terms of being able to meet those challenges. So that's something that I always look at and really feel good about when we see a grantee who's done a good job bringing us a description of that part of their work.
One thing that I'm finding more and more appealing in conversations with potential grantees, and Candida doesn't have a application process, there's no website. If you can find an application, more power to you. But I don't mean to be so obscure about it. It's just the way it's developed over the years, and you know, with an intent of going out of business. So to your point about plans looking like business plans, one of the things that I more and more want to see is what's your going out of business plan? How are you going to solve the problem you set out to solve, and then go disperse your organization? And so many organizations seek to be perpetual because that's just what organizations do. When Franklin Roosevelt helped get the Easter Seals campaign underway, March of Dimes campaign underway to address polio, they probably never anticipated it'd actually cure it. Now they tackle all birth defects, will never get them all, but you know, organizations have a habit of going on forever, and we've talked about how Candida, you know, most likely is not going to do that, and so I find very appealing plans that have a limited life, that we're going to solve a problem in the time frame that the donor behind Candida, you know, can enjoy in her lifetime. And who knows what that is, but you know, I'll give you an example. Is not an environmental example, and I recognize there are many problems on Earth that aren't going to be solved in the next 4 or 5 years. You know, were we only so fortunate? But in the education reform area, where Candida also is very active, I've been the largest single funder in Atlanta of the charter school program known as KIP, and there's a national organization with about 120 or so schools, and half a dozen of them here. And one of the cool things about the funding, the KIP build-out, which has been millions of dollars in funding now, probably 10 to 12 million just from Candida, is once we get to a certain number of schools, they won't need any more funding because it's a self-sustaining funding model. How appealing is that to a foundation? And how unappealing the idea that as your organization grows and does better, more important work, we have to write ever bigger checks. And for a foundation that seeks to go out of business in a few years, that's problematic, because if we were to grow with you as you ramp up writing ever bigger checks, we're probably going to be done before you are, and you've got a hole to fill. And we've helped create that hole. And frankly, we put you in financial distress the minute we funded you. So yeah, I have to be thoughtful about certain things that may be a little different from something like Burke Foundation, Burke Family Fund, that's been around for a long time. In the year I was born, in '54, and probably would be around, you know, another 58 years. But yeah, I just have some particular thoughts on that. So a going out of business plan, if that pertains to your organization, if that's germane for you.
Yeah, we, and I guess it was around 2008, we shifted our funding for our unrestricted grant making from, we were primarily programmatic support, and part of that was because our grants were not very large. Since we don't have a lot of unrestricted money, we couldn't make very large grants, so it seemed to make sense to fund specific programs of nonprofits. But what we learned was, one, there wasn't a lot of funders funding just general operating support, and that was what nonprofits screamed that they really needed, was just general operating support. So we made a shift to only fund general operating support of nonprofits. But what that meant was we looked really carefully at all aspects of the nonprofit, their board, their strategic plan, their staffing. And we say we don't even care what your mission is anymore. And it's not true, we do. But what we really care about is that you're going to be around for a few years and working to solve a problem, and that you have a plan to solve this problem, not just that you have one great program. So we look really carefully at a nonprofit's finances, that they're audited, that they have the staff and expertise they need to do the work they want to do. So to us, a plan is vital.
You know, one of the things that we've seen some of at Energy Foundation from some of our grantees over the last year is a real new focus, I think with an awareness that there are constraints on the resources, whether it's from the federal side or, the philanthropic world, that there are resource constraints. We've seen some grantees who've done some really strong work in thinking about how to leverage social media tools and individual donor fundraising to really great success. And in fact, we've seen it in one case in particular that I can think about with a grassroots small organization working in a fairly difficult state to fundraise in, who've really just been phenomenally successful in thinking better about how to engage people one-on-one to the degree that they can around the issues that they commonly care about. So I think that, from a funder perspective, that's an area where I look out and think, I would like to understand better how we can support our grantees in being able to do that. I mean, I think another thing we've seen some grantees start to think about is, even for those working in the nonprofit sector, are there things that you can, as an organization, develop that become revenue generating products or services that you provide? And I think those are the kinds of innovations that we really, sort of have a responsibility to foster. But it's an area where I feel like, at least personally, I could know more about how to be an effective supporter of the work that our grantees can do, and do a better job of helping to point people to that opportunity. So I'll say, at least, for those of you who are out there thinking about these questions, I'm definitely really interested in learning about what you see that works and doesn't work in that area, because I think it's going to be really important going forward. Mm-hmm. Jenny, you look like you had something that was...
I totally agree, and just in terms of messaging, it's totally key, and particularly thinking about the federal level, when it's pretty clear that there's not going to be climate legislation per se, and so the focus has been, seems to be more on what's happening at the state level or what's happening at the regulatory level, and in both cases, the messaging is really very important.
Jenny, do you want to say anything? I know we talked a little bit about, we had some conversation in advance of the panel, and one of the things we talked about as a trend is something called PRI, or program-related investments, and it sounds like Merck has done some thinking about how to potentially utilize that. Mm-hmm. It's something Energy Foundation hasn't looked at, but I'd love it if you might share more about what that is and how y'all think about it.
Well, all of us up here talk about mostly the 5%, which is what foundations have to give out by IRS rules. And there hasn't been, until sort of late, sort of much thinking about the other 95%, which is essentially the investment side and the endowment side of our portfolios. And there's a lot of things that can happen with that investment side. One is how those investments actually are made. Is it aligned with the program? Are there screens? Are there screens for certain investments in or certain investments out? Are there specific investments that are made that complement the focus on education or health or whatever it might be? Program-related investments is actually one tool that foundations have used for some time. The Merck Family Fund is really just sort of dabbling in it right now, but some of the larger foundations, Ford, MacArthur, et cetera, have done it for quite a long time. And in fact, I believe it's Ford, did a PRI with MESAD. Some of you may know this organization in Kentucky, for a rural on-bill financing pilot program that they have run, and that's how they got it started, was with a Ford 5-year PRI, which is sort of interesting. So the idea is that Ford essentially provided a loan to Mesa so that they could have a revolving fund that they could use for the capitalization of the energy efficiency that was happening for their rural residents. And it's an interesting way to think about how can foundations be involved beyond just the grant. So for any of you that are involved with conversations with foundations, it's always useful to think not just about the 5%, but to think about the 95%.
I definitely want us to make sure that we leave plenty of time for questions, and I think I saw a hand somewhere in the back. So I wonder, unless anybody has anything burning to add, maybe we can shift and take some questions from the audience? Sure. To the back.
Hi, I'm Jim Hackler, and do a lot of communication consulting and have been involved a lot with the startup community. And Shane is a B corporation, which is, I haven't heard you guys talk about social enterprise, and it sounds like that might be an opportunity from the investment standpoint. And maybe the whole kind of foundation nonprofit is the old model. And curious to see what you're thinking. I know in Atlanta they're trying to get a lot of these folks who are doing donations to think about investment and looking at this perpetual fund, and just curious to, what you guys think about that.
Well, we certainly are paying attention to the social enterprise world. I think, there's always a concern about if a nonprofit goes, too far into that non-related mission activity. And I met with a nonprofit yesterday, and it was such a beautiful social enterprise that fit their mission really well, and it was going to hopefully create some revenue for them. And so it can be done really well. I just think we're cautious about what it specifically is and how it's funded, and if it can be sustainable. As far as Atlanta, it seems like we talk a lot about it. I haven't seen a whole lot of action, I guess, around it yet, but I may not know about it. But there's certainly a lot of buzz, and I think we're still just kind of in the paying attention, looking out for what opportunities there are. I think from a donor standpoint, we have a few donors who are really interested in it. But it's certainly not the majority of our donor base.
This is for Jennifer and Jenny. I think the policy side, if you look at our public sector buildings, not federal, but municipal, state, school systems and all, one of the big policy issues is there's no connect, actually there's a legal disconnect between the operating budget and the capital budget. So the idea that you'd actually spend 10% more on the capital side to save significant amounts over 30 years on the operating side, are you all doing, in terms of the work you're doing on the policy side, what are you doing in that to affect that change? Because you're talking about a huge, huge inventory of buildings in this country.
That's a great question.
There's only so much we can do, and so I defer to my colleagues. Esteemed.
Well,
We
I will
met-
say, it's
Go ahead.
go ahead, Barry.
Well, a number of years ago, we met with leadership of one of the school systems in the community on the issue of helping them, do sort of a grants to green thing with school buildings and the like. And became pretty evident they had bigger fish to fry. And I think it's very challenging to push an economic argument in a group that isn't economically motivated. They have all the money they'll ever need because of tax money and just the way the system works. And, they have no motivation to save taxpayer money. They're very cynical about it from a government standpoint.
I can speak a little bit, not from a funding perspective so much, but certainly through the Recovery Act and the formula funds that went out through the State Energy Program, Energy Efficiency Conservation Block Grant Program. There was a lot of investment in energy service performance contracts and increasing the resources that we have, the technical assistance that we have around ESPCs, these energy service performance contracts, to overcome some of those barriers and to keep things on the operating side, despite the investment that's needed at the front end. There are some innovations in different types of products like MESAs, Managed Energy Service Agreements, as well, that we're seeing in a few places across the country. I think in the schools financing and efficiency, Ohio is doing quite a bit of interesting work, and that has a policy framework behind it that I'm not as intimately familiar with, but then there's also been Recovery Act and other state funding coming in behind to try to help actually move that along and do engineering studies and whatnot. Maryland as well, from what I understand. So there are definitely some efforts across the country. I'm not as familiar with what might be happening in the Southeast, but the Department of Energy Google Solution Center, and you can find a lot of information about a couple of those models at least.
I mean, I'll say, John, to your question, when I was at the Department of Commerce, one of the areas under my division was actually the state's performance contracting program, and also the annual reporting as to whether or not state buildings were meeting North Carolina's statutory goal for energy savings. And so it was always interesting, A, to try to round those numbers up when people, as Barry noted, don't always have a real incentive to report them, but B, to really think about how can we make those programs better. And I think my experience working with those programs at the state level probably says a lot about why I'm not sure that a lot of funders who fund in the national policy space are funding it. Because frankly, one of the great challenges, I think, in trying to address state buildings is that I'm not sure there are a lot of policies that have strong teeth. And so from a funder perspective, when you go and look for an opportunity to fund policy work, you want to look for the policies that are going to really have the highest return on your investment. And so while there's a tremendous opportunity in the public building space, there are also tremendous limitations in what states are willing to do, in how budgets, how much budgets can be manipulated, in the political will to kind of maintain those programs. And so it's a real, when you go to look at those kind of investments, I think you really do stop and say, if I invest in trying to advance these kind of savings programs, am I likely to see the kind of return on investment that I might get focusing on these other policies over here, or focusing more on the regulatory side of the process? And I think, so maybe that points to an opportunity to work with states, and maybe it's through organizations like the ones in this room, maybe it's through state energy offices, I'm not sure, but to think about some more robust approaches to those policies. But I think that's a real barrier from a funder perspective. Is the feeling that those policies are just not likely to be implemented at the level we want them to be. And I think that's going to continue to be a barrier. Sure. Yeah.
Speaking of scaling up and developing a dependable revenue stream, is anyone that y'all talk with, anyone you hear from, talking at all about Maine Housing Authority's recent sale of carbon offsets based on low-income energy efficiency retrofits? I can't find anybody.
That was Maine?
Yeah.
They did.
Yes.
I've only been there once. It's great in July.
Yeah.
Interesting.
You can
Let me
talk to
answer your
that.
question first.
Yeah.
We are
Yeah,
working
I was
with
gonna say, you got there before me.
Charlottesville
Yes.
right now and Cincinnati to take Maine State Housing carbon offset and bring it to a couple better building neighborhoods. But I want to take up Brewster Berlin's challenge. I'm Steve Morgan from Clean Energy Solutions. And before I do that, I wanted to mention that Jackie Dadicus and I, who works closely with SIA, also have a program for Danielle's program in Cincinnati that has Greater Cincinnati Foundation as a primary sponsor. They have put PRI money into the program and a loan fund for nonprofit buildings, among others. The Greater Cincinnati Energy Alliance is also housed in the building of the Greater Cincinnati Energy Alliance. And to your question of scale, 27 years ago, the Energy Office in Ohio, which then had money, they had the ERA equivalent, they had oil overcharge money, said, we have $1 million. Will the community foundations join us in creating a nonprofit loan program? 6 community foundations did. They ran a program for 2 years. They worked with United Ways and the community foundations. I don't know how many hundreds of buildings they did, and they even, in those days, were able to sell loans, but they did 2 things I want to ask you two whether you've done together. One is that they got the United Ways involved, and the other is anybody who wanted a grant from either United Way or, to the extent the donor-advised funds could do it, were asked 2 questions on the applications for money about anything. One of them was, have you done an energy audit in the last 5 years? Doesn't matter what you're applying for money for, you get asked this question. The second is, what energy-related capital improvements have you made in the last 5 years? So it sends a signal to all nonprofits who want money from any foundation that it's important. And then in your case, do you tell your grantees, or do you know, to the extent you're donor-advised funds, tell them about Barry's program and tell them how to get involved?
Yeah.
Well, let's see if I cover everything. We do have a question on all our applications now for our competitive grant-making programs that ask, I forget what the exact question is, but I want to say it's something like, what are your efforts to green up your facility or your operations? And so, you know, it is interesting how much just asking the question, how much that helps, generates further discussion. And so all our program officers, when they go on a site visit, will then, you know, they'll ask them, and it starts a conversation, and the conversation might lead to, oh, well, you should apply for a Grants to Green grant, or you should be doing this. The other question, which kind of goes to another question, is we ask nonprofits if are they involved in advocacy efforts? And it's been so funny to hear some of the nonprofits think, oh no, we can't do advocacy, or no, we don't do advocacy, thinking it's a negative. And we really encourage nonprofits just to think about it at least, and think about what they do. And a lot of them do it and don't think of it as advocacy. And so, to your point, just asking the question a lot of times is a big deal. What else? The United Ways, I don't think we've done anything in this area with the United Way. We do work really closely with our United Way on different things, but I don't think in this area we have. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. We haven't pressed the United Way to do that. We partnered with the United Way here on homelessness in a large program, but not with a strong green overlay. They haven't, in most other areas where Candida's been active, there's the question or two about, you know, describe how you're handling environmental matters, and it really goes back to, you know, 6 or 7 years ago when we sat down with the Community Foundation leadership and described the concept for Grants to Green, and I'd already approached Southface and they were in, so I had to have an operating partner in Community Foundation, and the initial reaction from one of the senior people was, well, we're not an environmental organization. I don't know if that really fits for us. And I went on to say, well, we don't really care who the grantees are. They're all going to do environmental projects because that's the nature of what this program would do. And, but, you know, if it's a better women's shelter or a food kitchen or whatever, it's going to get their costs down so that they can spend more of their time and resources on mission, whatever that mission is. And then the light bulbs went off. They got it. But not long after that, y'all added a clarifying question on all of your grant requests throughout the organization on environment. So it really, to your point about, you know, just ask the question, and that's a little camel's nose under the tent, and the next thing you know, somebody else is asking the question.
Question in the middle.
Hi, I'm Megan Shannon with the Enterprise Community Partners, and thank you for your support of our work around green initiatives and the nonprofits. What we're seeing recently is your year 15 exit strategies on affordable housing, and a number of the nonprofits throughout the country are taking these properties over in ownership under their own organization. And your Grant to Green Up program is about operations and facility. Would you consider, if the nonprofits are now taking ownership of a residential property, where if they were to green and create savings where they could recoup this to sustain operations of their organization, would you be interested in funding that?
We may be already, I'm not sure, but our consultant in DC is interfaced with Enterprise quite a bit, and I know at any given time there's $500,000 or $1 million between the institutions and you know, in commitments, and it may be to this program or it may be to something else. I'm just not sure. but we've interacted with Enterprise for a long time on the issue of that cool overlay of affordable green housing for, often a subsidized sort of tenant.
I think we have time for 2 more questions.
My question is for Danielle. I'm Jackie with Clean Energy Solutions, and since Steve stumped the rest of the panel, I'll pick on you a little bit. You mentioned early on that one of the few areas we'll probably see opportunities for funding this year is the state energy program. I guess mostly wanted to talk to you or raise for you the issue we have here in the Southeast of a lot of our state energy programs not really participating, and so it leaves our local on-the-ground partners without a way of accessing DOE funding. So if you could maybe talk to us a bit about what we can do in the short term, and also if we can ask you in the long term to think about other ways of getting money to people on the ground.
I'm not sure I followed the short-term question though, Jackie.
Well, short term, what can we do to just work with the state energy programs? If you had advice for us with our state energy offices to try to get them to use the state energy program money that they're being given?
I think I'll have to reference the earlier panel about relationships and open communications as far as the short term. On the long term, of course, there's a tremendous wealth of investment in blood, sweat, and tears at the DOE, across the ERE, in the Energy Efficiency Conservation Block Grant Program. The part of the sad reality of the Recovery Act is that there are a lot of people who have left DOE as well, and who aren't working there, but the commitment is still very, very, very strong to seeing these programs continue and doing what we can at the federal level with whatever budget we are given by our appropriators to help state and local governments continue clean energy strategies. So there are a lot of discussions happening. There are various leadership changes happening. There are going to be realignments and things, and it is certainly foremost in our minds. I don't have, those things have not played out yet, so I don't have answers at the moment, but we're not going to forget about you guys. Do we have one last question?
One last question.
So I'm going to bring this full circle, actually, I think, because John Knott spoke about how you can't change cities or communities without addressing social and economic issues, and there's obviously trends towards partnerships and collective impacts. What are foundations doing to accommodate for those trends, like pulling from different hot topics in like environment or education or social justice, and collectively pulling those resources to break it out to several different organizations, like a particular project or program, opposed to just giving it to a single nonprofit.
I can't speak for the foundation community, but from a Candida standpoint, I think the donor, and I speak for myself, have always liked those organizations or projects that represent a cross-section of interests. And, that might be, if we're interested in the arts, Woodruff Art Center here in town, then helping the facilities used by that group go green to the most reasonable extent possible, something we did a number of years ago. And so there's an overlay there, obviously, of culture and arts and a centerpiece sort of facility in the community to get the word out, and then the actual savings that can be enjoyed by the center. So I think foundations generally like those cross sections very much. Kill two birds with one stone. Who doesn't like to do that? I think it's tough to rely on the foundation community to pull those together, to pull the cross sections together and arrange the partnerships. I think that's very challenging to do. I'm part of another initiative around school reform where we're seeking to do that, and in the foundation community with its funding pot, looking to bring some organizations together to move farther, faster on school reform in the region, and I think we'll be successful in doing that. But I don't think that that's an everyday approach of sort of driving change from the foundations. The foundation community tends to be more responsive to requests and the like. And Merck may see it differently, but just one funder's perspective.
Yeah, well, not so much, but I think your point is well taken in terms of we all have to walk the walk. And I think John was great in his presentation this morning about making sure that all voices are heard. And philanthropy can't be ivory tower. It can't be out there and sort of telling folks what to do. And it's impossible to generalize about about the industry. However, I think it is becoming much more aware of the need to be inclusive around not only representation, but thought and approach, methodology. And I think some of the internal efforts are happening through both structured affinity groups and through individual foundations. So I think we're getting there. Whether it's both in terms of, I guess, how we interpret what our role is and also what the programs end up being externally, inviting all kinds of participants to the table. And certainly in the climate debate, that has become more and more obvious, is that it can't be just the environmental community who's speaking about this. So that's just sort of one example of how that's, okay, overdone, end of conversation. It has to be much broader than that.
I think I might chime in from a slightly different perspective, and I'll say this is actually one of the things for me that made me want to work in the field of philanthropy, which is not a field that I ever personally saw myself in. Working with Energy Foundation on the Southeast Regional Program has been a real opportunity to look out across the region that's been my home. It's been literally home to my family on one side since the 1750s, and a place where I care deeply about. And so, because Energy Foundation has in some ways understood some of our role, both to be a grant maker, but also to be a convener of the field, and to try to have a role building the field, whether that's through working with our grantees to help fundraise and make that fiscally sustainable, or whether it's working to build partnerships or working to, hash through new ideas. I think that's a role that we sometimes have a flexibility to step in and think about how we can play in ways that might not be a fit for how other foundations see their work. And sometimes it's really challenging. I mean, I will say it is very hard from a foundation perspective to figure out, and a program officer perspective to figure out how to do that effectively. And when I was in college, I took this class called Radical Social Critiques that I actually didn't do very well in, but for some reason I remember it. And I think about that class a lot as a funder, because it talks a lot about how do dynamics between human beings change when money becomes the currency that drives those relationships. And I think that's something as a funder we struggle with. But that's a long way of coming back and saying to your question that I do think there are opportunities for us as funders, and I think many of us are open to seeing those opportunities, to thinking about how we can work with you all to really help grow the field, to help build partnerships, to engage a more diverse group of organizations on the ground working on these issues, and also, frankly, how to engage a more diverse group of funders. So we've found in the last year that we have affinity with another funder, for example, whose interest is really in transparency and good governance issues. But it just so happens in some of our states that there are some good governance and transparency practices that could really be furthered significantly through work on clean energy, and particularly through work on regulatory processes. So I think it's important to be open to those, but I also think it's really important for us to have a good feedback loop with the advocacy community to get a sense of where we can be constructive in those roles, and frankly where we can't, because sometimes there is a risk of really doing some damage and stilting the equation when you don't understand as a funder how you can really help bring groups together and play that convening role.
just want to say one quick thing. Community foundations, we love to convene groups, and so sometimes it can be a great idea just to approach your local community foundation and let them be the facilitator, convener of a group that maybe it's hard to get those groups to talk in one office, but a community foundation can provide that neutral role. I think for our community foundation, we believe in, policy is often the best change, the best way to make a large change. And so, we are game for funding advocacy, large group efforts. And so, one example that comes to mind is the last several years we've been working to rewrite our juvenile justice code in the state, and it's required several groups to work together. And it's work that a lot of foundations don't want to fund because it's not very sexy or glossy. But the change that's going to happen because of rewriting the juvenile justice code is going to be very dramatic. And so I think if you can present a plan too that's not too pie in the sky, but is very practical and within a few years you can see dramatic changes if you have several groups work together, that can be very attractive to community foundations, I'll speak for.
Well, I think we're out of time, and hopefully we've worked through all the questions. But I just want to say thank you to all of our panelists and to you all for engaging us with good questions, and I think giving us a lot of things to continue to think about together in terms of how we can all build this work going forward. So thank you.
So thanks to our panel. We have a 3:30 deadline to get out of the room, so we're going to get out of here in a second. I will be brief, but if everybody will hold their applause, I want to go through a list of thank yous because there are many people. But at the start of the day, I asked each of you to leave here with at least one takeaway of an action to do, a thought that you are going to reflect on and take with you. So I'm going to come back to that at the end of this and ask for a couple people to raise their hands. Mine is quite simple. This has been extraordinary. Your participation has been fantastic. The range of people that have been in this room and in this dialogue has been truly impressive and inspiring. And so I commit to making sure SIA continues to do this on a regular basis. And so I'm doing my homework. March 5th, 8 to 9:30, we're having our first quarterly breakfast meeting of the year here in Atlanta at Kilpatrick Townsend. It'll be on high-performance schools. So we hope you'll join us for that. But hold your applause until the end. This is kind of like the Oscars since they're Sunday. A couple important thank yous. Thank you to Julie Stewart. We will have, as you go out, look at the work that she's done today. We have some of them up on the board as well. We'll be sending these out electronically so you can reflect on what we talked about and have it with you. Phoenix Group, Jamie and Kristen, who most of you met, helped pull this event together and kept us running on time. AV Matters in the back. Thanks to each of you, our panels and speakers, and last but certainly not least, our staff. What some of you in the room don't know, or that many of you probably do at this point because you're part of the Southern Consortium, this has been a 3-day affair. We have had 3 days of meetings from sunup to sundown, and so thank you for your hard work. So let's give everybody that I just mentioned a round of applause. So before I ask for an offering, one or two people to talk about their activity or their takeaway, I sort of wanted to capture some of the things that stood out on here for me. The biggest is that this is all about people. The work we do, it's people. And so as a result of that, we have to understand our history, where we are, how we have roots to that, the place that we are, both in mental, physical, the work that we're doing, but also having conversations. We've got to talk to each other and start there if we're going to move the dialogue forward and move the needle on these policies, which is ultimately what we're trying to do. We're trying to transform a market. So with that, does anybody want to be brave enough to offer up one of their to-dos that they're going to walk out of here with, or a thought? Will in the back. One more, and then they're going to chase us out of here. Anyone? Bueller? All right. Thank you all very much. This has been fantastic. We appreciate your time, and look forward to working with you after today.
Attack, front to back, in this thing called rap. Feeling like a double rhyme double on a heavenly level. Bang the bass, turn up the treble. Flash on my day and night all the time. 714, wise the line. Maniac, radiac.